55 rooms, 46,000 square feet of hand-carved luxury, $3 million spent creating the most expensive private residence in California history. And 4 months after the heir moved in with his wife and 5 children, 2 men lay dead in a guest bedroom, each killed by a single bullet to the head. February 16, 1929. The bodies were found together. Ned Doheny, 35 years old, son of one of America's richest men, and Hugh Plunkett, his childhood friend, his secretary, his constant companion. The official story came quickly. Murder-suicide, a mentally unstable employee, case closed within days. But the evidence didn't match the narrative. The gun was warm, as if heated. A smoldering cigarette remained in the dead man's fingers. The bodies had been moved before police arrived. 4 hours passed between the shots and the call to authorities, and both men were key witnesses in the biggest political scandal of the decade, the Teapot Dome affair that had already destroyed reputations and ended careers. This is Greystone Mansion, and this is the story of how oil money, political corruption, father-son devotion, and unexplained violence converged in Beverly Hills to create a mystery that has never been solved. A story that begins not in California's sunshine, but in the muddy oil fields of Los Angeles and the dark political corridors of Washington. A story about what happens when American ambition builds something magnificent, then watches it all collapse in blood and scandal. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you enjoy learning about the fascinating histories behind the world's most remarkable estates, consider subscribing to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. I love seeing how this community stretches across the globe, united by our shared curiosity about these architectural treasures. The mansion still stands. You can visit it today, walk its grounds, peer through its windows. But the ghost bedroom on the east wing, where everything ended that February night, remains, and the questions remain. Murder? Suicide? Cover-up? Let's begin with the man who made it all possible. The Irish immigrant's son who became richer than Rockefeller. Chapter 1. The Prospector who became a king. Edward Lawrence Doheny was born August 10, 1856 in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. His father Patrick had fled County Tipperary during Ireland's Great Famine, escaping starvation like millions of others. He'd tried whaling in Labrador before settling in Wisconsin, where he worked construction and gardening, manual labor that barely kept the family fed. Edward's mother Eleanor had been a schoolteacher in Newfoundland before marriage pulled her into Patrick's struggling world. The family was poor, deeply poor, but Edward was bright. He graduated high school at 15, valedictorian of his class. Months later, his father died. The family had nothing. So Edward took a job with the United States Geological Survey, heading west to Kansas to survey Kiowa Comanche lands. He was 16 years old on his own, and the West became his education. For the next 20 years, Edward Doheny drifted. He prospected for gold in South Dakota's Black Hills. He worked silver mines in Arizona Territory. He tried his hand in New Mexico, where the rough mining camps were filled with men like him, ambitious, desperate, willing to do whatever it took to strike fortune. Some accounts suggest he worked as a mule driver, a fruit packer, even a singing waiter. Darker rumors claimed he'd been a pimp, that he'd killed a man in Laredo, Texas. Whether these stories were true or legend built around a man who'd later become controversial, they illustrated Doheny's early life. Hardscrabble, violent, uncertain. During those New Mexico years, he made friends who'd matter later. Charles Canfield, another miner, became his partner, and Albert Fall, a lawyer with political ambitions, became a friend. These relationships, forged in dusty mining towns in the 1880s, would shape American history decades later. By 1892, Doheny was 43 years old. He'd been prospecting for over 20 years. He'd found nothing. He was living in a Los Angeles boarding house with his first wife Carrie and their daughter Eileen. They hadn't paid rent in months. He was a failure, middle-aged, broke, with no prospects. And then he noticed something. A black wagon driver passed by with a load of dark, greasy substance. Doheny stopped him. "What was it?" the driver said. "Tar," in Spanish. It came from an empty lot near Westlake Park. Doheny took a streetcar to investigate. He saw black ooze bubbling from the ground. A nearby factory was using the tar as fuel, and Doheny realized this wasn't tar, this was oil. He convinced a friend to put up $400. They leased a 3-lot piece of land. Using a sharpened tree trunk as a drill, primitive beyond belief, they started digging. In April 1893, at 200 feet, they struck oil. Real oil, flowing steadily. Doheny was 43 years old. His fortune-hunting days were over. He'd finally found it. What followed was a petroleum boom that transformed Los Angeles. Doheny and Canfield bought land across the city for oil exploration. They sold their initial discovery and used the money to expand. Within a few years, more than 3,000 oil wells dotted Los Angeles. The city that would become famous for movies was first an oil town, and Doheny was one of the men who made that happen. He convinced railroads to switch from coal to oil. The Southern Pacific. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, they listened to Doheny because he could provide cheap fuel and lots of it. The partnership with the railroads made him wealthy, but he wasn't done. Mexico's Quote One in Tampico called to him. In 1901, Doheny drilled the first well in Mexico. The oil there was even richer than Los Angeles. He leased 1 million acres around Tampico on the Gulf of Mexico. His Mexican Petroleum Company became the largest oil producer in Mexico. He built roads, cities, railroads, pipelines. During the Mexican Revolution, when chaos threatened his operations, Doheny hired his own private army to protect his fields. By 1922, his Mexican operations alone had brought him $31 million in profit. He expanded to Venezuela, Lake Maracaibo, more oil fields, more infrastructure, more money. His holdings developed as Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company, one of the largest oil corporations in the world. By 1925, Edward Doheny's net worth passed $100 million. He was richer than John D. Rockefeller. The poorest Irish immigrant's son, the failed prospector who couldn't pay his boarding house rent, had become the wealthiest man in America. He bought Chester Place in Los Angeles, a gated community of Victorian mansions. Eventually, he owned most of the houses and the street itself. He built St. Vincent de Paul Catholic Church at Figueroa and Adams. He became a major donor to Catholic institutions. The church that had sustained his immigrant parents now received his fortune's blessings. But Edward Doheny had one great sorrow that money couldn't fix. His daughter Eileen had died at age 7. His first wife Carrie had died, though he'd remarried a woman named Estelle. Of his children, only one survived. His son, Edward Jr., called Ned, born November 6, 1893. This boy would inherit everything. This boy was the future of the Doheny Empire. This boy had to be perfect. Chapter 2. The Son and Heir. Ned Doheny grew up knowing he was heir to one of America's great fortunes, but he also grew up knowing about loss. His older sister Eileen died when he was young. He saw how her death haunted his father. He understood even as a child that he carried his parents' hopes. He was the only son left. He had to succeed. His father's oil discoveries happened when Ned was a baby. By the time Ned could remember, the family was already rich. He didn't grow up struggling. He grew up in privilege, educated in private schools, given every advantage money could buy. But Edward Doheny was a hard man who'd come from nothing, and he expected his son to be worthy of the fortune he'd inherit. Ned was smart, capable, well-liked. He attended good schools. He learned the oil business from his father. By the time he was in his 20s, he was managing parts of his father's empire, traveling to Mexico, handling business deals, proving he could lead when his father eventually stepped aside. In 1914, at age 21, Ned married Lucy Smith of Pasadena. She came from a wealthy California family, respectable, established. The wedding joined two fortunes, two California dynasties. It was the kind of marriage Edward Doheny approved of. Lucy was elegant, refined, capable of managing a household that would befit the Doheny name. Ned and Lucy had 5 children together. The family was growing. The next generation of Dohenys was secured. Everything Edward had built would continue through his son's children. The dynasty was established, but Ned lived in his father's enormous shadow. Every business decision was really his father's decision. Every achievement was compared to what Edward had accomplished. Ned was capable, but he wasn't the self-made prospector who'd struck oil with a sharpened tree trunk. He was the son, the heir, the one who'd been given everything. And he knew the difference. Through all of it, one person remained constant in Ned's life: Theodore Hugh Plunkett. Hugh and Ned had known each other since childhood. Hugh came from New Mexico, possibly connected to Ned through the Doheny family's early mining days in the territory. The exact origins of their friendship aren't fully documented, but by Ned's adult years, Hugh was indispensable. Hugh wasn't just an employee. He was Ned's secretary, his confidant, his business manager, his companion. Hugh often signed checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars on Ned's behalf. He attended to details of the Doheny business empire. He traveled with Ned. He was trusted with the family's most sensitive matters. The Dohenys gave Hugh his own key to their properties. He was treated almost like family. This closeness would later spark rumors. Were they merely friends? Was there something more? In an era when homosexuality was criminal and deeply stigmatized, such relationships were hidden, coded, unspeakable. The question would hang over their deaths and has never been definitively answered. What's certain is that Hugh Plunkett was Ned Doheny's constant companion for years, trusted beyond what most employers trusted any secretary. In the 1920s, Ned managed his father's operations while Edward dealt with an increasingly complicated political situation. The oil empire required government cooperation, naval contracts, land leases, regulatory approvals. Edward Doheny understood that oil wealth and political power were intertwined, and he had an old friend from his New Mexico mining days who was now in a position to help. Albert Fall had gone from lawyer to United States Senator from New Mexico. In 1921, President Warren G. Harding appointed Fall as Secretary of the Interior. Edward Doheny's friend from the mining camps now controlled America's public lands, including naval oil reserves. The old friendship was about to become very profitable and very dangerous. Chapter 3: A Gift of Stone and Dreams. By 1925, Edward Doheny was 70 years old and phenomenally wealthy. His son Ned was 32, married with 5 children. The time had come for Edward to do what wealthy men do: build a monument, not for himself, but for his son. Beverly Hills was emerging as Los Angeles' most exclusive community. The hills above Sunset Boulevard offered privacy, views, space. Oil barons, studio heads, industrialists were building estates there, creating a new American aristocracy in Southern California's sunshine. Edward Doheny bought 415 acres on the eastern edge of Beverly Hills. The land commanded views over Los Angeles. It was perfect. He hired architect Gordon Burney Kaufman. Kaufman was English-born, educated at London Polytechnic Institute before moving to Canada and then California in 1914. By the mid-1920s, Kaufman had established himself through work in the Mediterranean Revival style popular in Southern California, but also through his mastery of English architectural traditions. He designed estates for wealthy Los Angeles families, the Chandlers, the Adamses. He understood how to create residences that conveyed both elegance and permanence. For the Doheny Commission, Kaufman turned to Tudor Revival, a style rare in Southern California but perfect for Edward's vision. This wasn't going to be a Spanish hacienda or Mediterranean villa. This was going to be an English manor house, stone and slate, something that looked like it had stood for centuries, even though it would be built in months. Something that announced the Dohenys had arrived not just as rich, but as American aristocracy. Construction began February 15, 1927. The contractor was P.J. Walker Company. The landscape architect was Paul G. Tiena, who designed formal English gardens, cascading waterfalls, a lake, terraced grounds that complemented the mansion's architecture with Gothic and neoclassic elements. The mansion itself was extraordinary: 55 rooms, 46,000 square feet of living space. The structure was built with steel-reinforced concrete for stability in California's earthquake-prone ground, then faced with Indiana limestone. The roof used Welsh slate, imported from Britain. Every detail conveyed quality and permanence. Inside, craftsmen hand-carved oak banisters, balustrades, and rafters. Each of the 7 chimneys was designed and crafted by a different artist, making every one unique. The floors of the grand hall featured black and white inlaid marble. The living room held a balcony where musicians could perform during parties. The kitchen included a pantry with a wall safe for storing the family's silver and gold services. The main staircase descended dramatically through the center of the house. It would later become one of Hollywood's most famous sets, appearing in countless films. The proportions, the craftsmanship, the way light fell on the stone, Kaufman had created something exceptional. The mansion included servants' quarters on 2 floors of the East Wing, accommodating a live-in staff of 15. This wasn't just a house, it was an estate that required constant maintenance, a small village unto itself. Beyond the main residence, the grounds included stables and kennels for the family's horses and dogs, tennis courts for recreation, a fire station, because the property was so large and isolated that it needed its own emergency services, a swimming pool and pavilion for entertaining, a greenhouse for year-round flowers. The lake and waterfalls that Tina designed created an English country estate atmosphere impossible to achieve naturally in Southern California's dry climate. The total cost was staggering, $3,166,578.12. The mansion alone cost $1,238,378.76. In today's dollars, that's over $57 million for the complete estate. It was the most expensive home ever built in California. Nothing in the state came close. The Los Angeles Times reported on the construction. Society pages tracked the progress. This was Edward Doheny announcing that his family had transcended mere wealth. They were building dynasty. They were establishing permanence. The name Doheny would be remembered for generations because of this monument in stone. But Ned Doheny wasn't in California to watch the construction progress. He was in Washington, D.C., dealing with a nightmare that threatened to destroy everything his father had built. Hugh Plunkett oversaw much of the Greystone construction in Ned's absence. Hugh signed the checks, met with contractors, handled the details. This was typical of how Ned relied on Hugh for everything. Hugh was the one making sure Edward Doheny's gift to his son was being built correctly. Hugh was the one ensuring that when Ned finally could move in, everything would be perfect. Construction took 3 years. By September 1928, the mansion was finished enough for occupancy, though work would continue for months more. Ned, Lucy, and their 5 children finally moved into Greystone. It had been commissioned as a wedding gift years earlier. But the Teapot Dome scandal had delayed everything. Now, finally, the family was home. The mansion was everything Edward had envisioned. A palace for his son, a statement that the Dohenys had arrived, a home that would shelter generations. It was magnificent. It was also cursed. Chapter 4. The Scandal That Poisoned Everything. The trouble began in 1921 with what Edward Doheny called a loan to an old friend, Albert Fall. Doheny's companion from the New Mexico mining camps decades earlier had become Warren G. Harding's Secretary of the Interior. Fall controlled America's public lands, including naval petroleum reserves set aside for the Navy's use in case of war. These reserves included Elk Hills and Buena Vista Hills in California, and Teapot Dome in Wyoming, named for an unusual rock formation that looked like a teapot. Fall had financial problems. His ranch near Sierra Blanca Peak in New Mexico had unpaid taxes. He owed money. Despite his powerful position, he needed cash. On November 28, 1921, Edward Doheny signed a proposal to build an oil storage depot at Pearl Harbor in exchange for the Navy's crude oil from Elk Hills. It was a sweetheart deal for Doheny's Pan American Petroleum Company, exclusive rights to drill naval reserves, expected profits of $100 million from extracting 250 million barrels of oil. The very next day, Fall called Doheny and told him the quote two they discussed was due. Doheny dispatched his son Ned and Hugh Plunkett to deliver the money. The two men went to Blair and Company brokerage house in New York. They withdrew $100,000 in cash from Ned's account. They wrapped the money in paper, put it in a little black bag, and took a train to Washington, D.C. On a December evening in 1921, Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett delivered $100,000 in cash to Albert Fall at his apartment in the Wardman Park Hotel. Fall gave them a receipt for the quote, 3. The transaction took minutes. Ned and Hugh returned to Los Angeles. The deal was done. Edward Doheny got his oil leases. Albert Fall got his $100,000, which he used to pay off his ranch debts and make improvements to his property. Everything seemed fine. It was the kind of business that powerful men conducted quietly, old friends helping each other. Nothing unusual, except it was bribery, and it was about to explode into the worst political scandal in American history before Watergate. Harry Sinclair, another oil magnate, had made a similar deal with Fall for the Teapot Dome Reserve in Wyoming, paying Fall $300,000 in bonds and cash. Together, the Doheny and Sinclair deals represented nearly $500,000 in payments to a sitting cabinet member in exchange for oil leases worth hundreds of millions. In 1923, Senator Thomas J. Walsh of Montana launched an investigation. President Harding had died suddenly in August of 1923, possibly from stress related to the brewing scandals in his administration. Calvin Coolidge became president and appointed special counsels to investigate. The scope of corruption in the Harding administration began to emerge. Attorney General Harry Daugherty was implicated. Veterans Bureau head Charles Forbes was convicted on bribery charges. The Harding presidency was revealed as monumentally corrupt, but Teapot Dome became the centerpiece scandal. The name became synonymous with government. Corruption. Congressional hearings were sensational. Fall testified that the oil leases were necessary for national security, to prevent drainage from adjacent oil fields, and to build strategic fuel storage at Pearl Harbor in case of war with Japan. He insisted the $100,000 from Doheny was a personal loan between old friends. Nothing more. Edward Doheny testified before the Senate. He admitted the $100,000 quote 4, but insisted it was unrelated to the oil deals. Just one friend helping another. The fact that the loan came the day after the oil lease was approved was, he claimed, coincidental. Nobody believed him. The public was outraged. The press hammered the story. Teapot Dome became the benchmark for government corruption. Quote 5. One newspaper reporter wrote cynically when wealthy defendants seemed to escape justice. The legal proceedings stretched for years. Civil suits to cancel the oil leases. Criminal cases for conspiracy and bribery. Trial after trial, appeal after appeal. In 1927, the Supreme Court ruled the leases had been obtained corruptly. Both the Elk Hills and Teapot Dome leases were invalidated and returned to the Navy. The Supreme Court declared Fall, quote 6 Fall, was charged with bribery. So were Doheny and Sinclair. But the trials became a legal circus. Fall and Doheny were acquitted of conspiracy in one trial. Sinclair's first trial with Fall ended in a mistrial. Fall wasn't retried due to health issues. The conspiracy charges fell apart, but the bribery charges proceeded, and Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett were key witnesses. They delivered the money. They'd been in that hotel room. They knew exactly what happened. Their testimony would determine whether their father and Fall went to prison. The pressure on both men was enormous. Ned faced the possibility of sending his own father to jail if he testified honestly about what he'd witnessed. Hugh faced perjury charges if he lied to protect the Dohenys. Both men knew their testimony could destroy Edward Doheny. By February 1929, the trials were reaching their climax. Fall's bribery trial was scheduled. Ned and Hugh would have to testify. The stress was unbearable. Hugh, according to later accounts, was showing signs of mental breakdown. He was sleeping poorly. His hands would shake. His jaw would clench. He seemed terrified of what was coming. The Doheny family was under siege. Edward's reputation was destroyed. The man who'd been richer than Rockefeller was now a national symbol of corruption. Stockholders were suing his companies. The government was demanding repayment of profits from the oil leases. Everything Edward had built through 4 decades was collapsing. And in September 1928, in the middle of this nightmare, Ned Doheny moved his family into the magnificent mansion his father had built. Greystone was supposed to represent triumph. Instead, it became the setting for tragedy. Chapter 5. September 1928. Moving into Paradise. September 1928. After 3 years of construction, Greystone Mansion was ready. Not quite finished, work would continue for months more on certain details, but habitable. Ned and Lucy Doheny moved in with their 5 children. The family that had waited so long for this magnificent gift finally took possession. The children must have been amazed. 55 rooms to explore, staircases that seemed to descend forever, bedrooms larger than most people's entire homes. The grounds stretched across what felt like a private kingdom. 18 acres of terraced gardens, waterfalls, a lake, tennis courts, a swimming pool. For children growing up in one of America's wealthiest families, this was still extraordinary. The staff of 15 live-in servants made the household function: cooks, housekeepers, gardeners, chauffeurs, personal attendants. The East Wing servant quarters housed them in comfortable accommodations, though nothing like the family's opulent spaces. Every morning, the staff would wake early to prepare the house for the day. Fires lit in the massive fireplaces, meals prepared in the enormous kitchen. The grounds maintained to perfection. The stables housed the family's horses. Ned enjoyed riding, and the children were learning. The kennels kept their dogs, well-bred animals that required professional care. The tennis courts saw regular use. The pool was heated for year-round swimming, a luxury in 1928 when most pools were seasonal. The fire station stood ready, a necessity for an estate so large and isolated. If fire broke out, the Beverly Hills Fire Department might arrive too late. The Dohenys needed their own emergency capability. It was the kind of precaution that only enormous wealth could afford. The greenhouse produced flowers year-round. Lucy could have fresh arrangements in every room, changed daily without ever worrying about cost or availability. The gardens Tina had designed were maturing beautifully, the cascading waterfalls creating peaceful sounds that filled the estate. Inside the mansion, the grand hall's black and white marble floors reflected light from massive windows. The hand-carved woodwork throughout the house represented thousands of hours of skilled craftsmen's labor. The living room's balcony for musicians meant the family could host evenings where string quartets or pianists performed while guests mingled below. The wall safe in the pantry held silver and gold service sets worth a fortune themselves. Every bathroom featured the latest fixtures. The bedrooms were enormous, each child having space that most families would consider a full apartment. Lucy and Ned's master suite was palatial, with sitting areas, dressing rooms, and views across Los Angeles. This was what $3 million bought in 1928. This was the most expensive home in California. This was Edward Doheny's gift to his son and declaration to the world that the Dohenys had arrived at the absolute pinnacle of American society. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The family moved into Greystone while Edward Doheny was being destroyed by Teapot Dome. The newspapers that praised the mansion's magnificence also ran headlines about bribery and corruption. The society pages that covered the Dohenys' parties also printed updates on the trials. The house that was supposed to represent triumph was overshadowed by scandal. Ned tried to maintain normalcy for his children. They attended good schools. They had birthday parties at Greystone. They learned to ride horses and play tennis and swim in their private pool. But their father was constantly traveling to Washington for legal proceedings. Their grandfather's name was being dragged through newspapers across the country. The stress penetrated even the mansion's thick limestone walls. Hugh Plunkett was a constant presence. He had his own rooms in the guest wing, stayed at Greystone frequently, managed household affairs when Ned was away. The children knew him as Uncle Hugh. He was part of the family in ways that went beyond his formal role as Ned's secretary. He ate meals with them, he attended family gatherings. His own key to Greystone meant he could come and go freely. Lucy managed the household with the help of the staff, but the scale was overwhelming. 15 servants required supervision. The grounds needed constant attention. Social obligations came with being the Doheny heir's wife. She was expected to entertain, to host, to represent the family at Los Angeles society events, all while her husband dealt with the legal nightmare and her children tried to grow up normally in extraordinary circumstances. The mansion was beautiful. The lifestyle was privileged beyond imagination, but happiness was elusive. How do you enjoy paradise when your family's reputation is being destroyed? How do you relax in luxury when you know you might have to testify against your own father? 4 months. Ned and Lucy had 4 months in their dream home before everything ended. September, October, November, December, January, early February. The holidays came and went. Christmas at Greystone must have been spectacular. The massive house decorated, gifts for 5 children. The staff preparing elaborate meals. But the new year brought no relief from the legal pressures. Fall's trial was approaching. Ned and Hugh would have to testify soon. The reckoning was coming, and Hugh Plunkett was falling apart. Chapter 6. Hugh Plunkett, the Indispensable Man. Theodore. Hugh Plunkett remains a mystery. The exact details of his early life, where he came from, how he met Ned Doheny, these facts are lost or were never recorded. What's documented is that by Ned's adult years, Hugh was indispensable. He wasn't just a secretary in the traditional sense. He was Ned's business manager, handling financial matters that would normally require multiple employees. Hugh signed checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars on Ned's authority. He managed details of the Doheny oil empire's operations. He traveled with Ned constantly, handling logistics, arrangements, communications. When Edward Doheny needed someone trusted to deliver $100,000 in cash to Albert Fall, he sent his son, Ned and Hugh Plunkett. That decision made Hugh a central witness in the Teapot Dome scandal. Hugh had been in that hotel room. He'd seen the cash change hands. He knew exactly what happened. His testimony could send Albert Fall to prison. It could also implicate Edward Doheny in a bribery scheme. The legal strategy for the Doheny defense depended partly on Hugh's testimony, supporting the loan between friends narrative. Fall had given a receipt, which the defense presented as proof this was a legitimate loan, not a bribe. Hugh could testify that the transaction looked like a loan, that Ned and Edward believed it was a loan, that there was no explicit quid pro quo discussed in that hotel room. But Hugh also knew the truth. The loan came the day after the oil lease was approved. The timing wasn't coincidental. Everyone involved understood what was happening. If Hugh testified honestly about what he witnessed and understood, the defense would collapse. This placed Hugh in an impossible position. Tell the truth and destroy the family that employed him, trusted him, treated him like family. Lie under oath and face perjury charges if caught. Either way, his life would never be the same after testifying. The pressure manifested physically. Multiple accounts describe Hugh in early 1929 as increasingly distressed. He wasn't sleeping well. His hands trembled. He seemed nervous, distracted, unable to focus. Lucy Doheny's personal secretary later confirmed that Hugh had, quote, ate. Quote, the Doheny family became concerned about Hugh's mental state. Dr. E.C. Fishbaugh, the family physician, was brought in to evaluate Hugh. According to later testimony, the doctor thought Hugh might need psychiatric care. The family considered having Hugh committed to a sanitarium, ostensibly for his mental health. But there was a darker interpretation of this plan. If Hugh was institutionalized as mentally unstable, he couldn't testify. A witness confined to a mental hospital for, quote, 9, quote, could be excluded from trial. Albert Fall's defense had already used this tactic. One of Fall's friends, who was supposed to testify, had been committed to an asylum. Supposedly insane, conveniently unavailable for questions. Hugh saw what was happening. He faced 2 forms of captivity: testify and possibly go to prison for perjury, or refuse the sanitarium and be committed anyway. Either way, his freedom was ending. The upcoming trial loomed over everything. Hugh's nephew later said that the pressure debilitated Hugh. The choice between testifying against the Dohenys or being locked away as mentally unfit was destroying him. He was trapped on the afternoon of February 16, 1929, according to Dr. Fishbaugh's later account. He, Ned, and Lucy confronted Hugh at Greystone. They urged him to accept a, quote, 11 at a sanitarium. They framed it as concern for his health, but everyone in that room understood what it really meant. Dr. Fishbaugh claimed Hugh refused. That was the doctor's story. Hugh sitting there, trembling, refusing help, insisting he'd be fine. The image painted was of a man clearly unwell, clearly needing intervention, stubbornly refusing the help being offered. But what if Hugh saw it differently? What if he saw the sanitarium as a prison, a way to silence him before the trial? What if his refusal to go quietly made him dangerous to the Dohenys? We'll never know what Hugh was thinking that afternoon. We only know that by the next morning, he was dead. Chapter 7. The night of February 16th. The official timeline, as related primarily by Lucy Doheny and Dr. Fishbaugh, went like this. After the afternoon confrontation at Greystone failed to convince Hugh to enter a sanitarium, Ned and Lucy decided to visit Hugh at his apartment that evening. They wanted to continue urging him to get help. According to their account, during this visit, Ned made some impulsive remarks that upset Hugh. The nature of these remarks was never specified. The visit ended poorly. Hugh agitated, Ned and Lucy returning to Greystone. Around 9:30 in the evening, Hugh Plunkett drove to Greystone. He called from the gates. Lucy answered. She told him he shouldn't come in, that Ned was tired, that this wasn't a good time. Hugh ignored her. He used his personal key to enter the grounds and the house. He went directly to a guest bedroom in the east wing, a room where he often stayed when visiting. The guest bedroom had a telephone connected to the mansion's switchboard. At some point after arriving, Hugh used this phone to call Ned, asking if they could talk. Ned went to meet him in the guest bedroom. What happened when Ned entered that room? What was said? What transpired between them? Nobody knows. There were no other witnesses to what came next. Around 11 o'clock in the evening, Lucy heard a gunshot, not immediately near her, but from somewhere in the mansion, the east wing. She didn't investigate the sound herself. Instead, she called Dr. Fishbaugh, the family physician. This was the first strange detail. Your husband is in the house. You hear a gunshot, and you don't run to find him. You don't call out. You call the doctor instead of the police. Lucy's explanation was never fully articulated, but the implication was that she somehow knew medical help would be needed, not police help. Doctor. Fishbaugh was at a theater performance in Hollywood when his maid called with Lucy's urgent message. He left immediately and drove to Greystone, arriving shortly before 11 o'clock. The timeline here is compressed. If Lucy heard the shot around 11 and Fishbaugh arrived before 11, either the times are wrong or Fishbaugh drove impossibly fast from Hollywood. Lucy met him when he arrived. She told him that Hugh and Ned were in the guest bedroom. Together, they walked down the hallway toward the east wing. As they approached the bedroom, they saw the door standing slightly open. Hugh Plunkett stood just inside, visible through the gap. According to Fishbaugh's later testimony, Hugh looked distressed. He warned them to come no closer. Then he shut the door. Lucy and the doctor stood in the hallway. They heard a second gunshot from inside the bedroom. Then silence. They waited. How long? The accounts don't say. Then they entered the room. Ned Doheny lay on the floor, shot in the head behind the right ear. He was still breathing, unconscious but alive. Blood pooled beneath him. Hugh Plunkett lay nearby, also shot in the head. A revolver was in his hand, still warm. Hugh's body was positioned so that the gun was beneath him. A cigarette smoldered between Hugh's fingers. Dr. Fishbaugh later testified that when he entered, Ned was still alive and breathing, though unconscious. This contradicted earlier statements where he'd said both men were dead when he arrived. The inconsistency raised questions about what really happened and when. The police were not called immediately. Dr. Fishbaugh attended to Ned, but there was nothing to be done. The bullet had entered Ned's brain. He was dying. Hugh was already dead. But instead of calling police to report the shooting, hours passed. 4 hours. From the gunshots around 11 p.m. until police were finally called around 3 a.m., 4 hours elapsed. During that time, evidence at the scene was altered. The bodies were moved. The room was rearranged. By the time police arrived, the crime scene had been thoroughly contaminated. Edward Doheny's private security detail was at Greystone within the hour before police. They controlled the scene, decided what would be photographed, what would be documented, who would be allowed access. The Doheny family's enormous wealth meant they could manage the situation before authorities even knew it had happened. When police finally did arrive, they found a neat narrative waiting for them. Hugh Plunkett, mentally unstable, had killed Ned Doheny in a fit of madness, then turned the gun on himself. Murder-suicide. Case closed. The district attorney Buren Fitz accepted this conclusion almost immediately, but forensic investigator Leslie White, who processed the scene, had doubts, serious doubts. The cigarette in Hugh's hand was still smoldering when they found him. White found this bizarre. A man who just murdered his best friend in a fit of madness, about to kill himself, paused to light a cigarette and held it carefully in his fingers as he shot himself. The cigarette should have fallen. It should have been dropped or crushed. Instead, it remained delicately positioned, suggesting Hugh's hand was placed that way after death. The gun was beneath Hugh's body and very warm, as if it had been heated. White noted that the temperature seemed wrong for a gun that had just been fired. It felt like someone had warmed it, possibly in an oven or near a heat source, before placing it in the dead man's hand. The wound patterns didn't match the official story either. Ned had been shot at extremely close range, possibly contact range. The bullet entered behind his right ear at an angle, suggesting someone standing very close. Hugh's wound appeared to be from a different distance, not contact range. If Hugh shot Ned then himself, the wounds should look similar. They didn't. The bodies had clearly been moved. Blood patterns and positioning indicated they'd been in different locations when shot, then repositioned before police arrived. Why move bodies unless you're staging a scene? White documented all of this. His photographs showed the inconsistencies. His notes recorded his suspicions, but he was overruled. The Doheny family's attorneys were already controlling the narrative. District Attorney Fitz, possibly influenced by the family's enormous wealth and political connections, declared the case solved. Murder-suicide. No further investigation needed. Within 2 days, Fitz announced there would be no inquest, no deeper investigation. The case was closed. Hugh Plunkett, driven mad by stress over the upcoming trial, had killed his friend and employer. Then killed himself. That was the official conclusion. The speed was suspicious. The lack of thorough investigation was suspicious. The 4-hour delay before calling police was suspicious. The moved bodies, the warm gun, the positioned cigarette. All suspicious. But Edward Doheny was one of the richest men in America. His son had just been murdered, and the official conclusion protected the family from even more scandal. What really happened in that guest bedroom? We'll never know for certain, but the official story had too many holes to be believable. Chapter 8. The investigation that wasn't District Attorney Buren Fitz had come into office promising to clean up corruption in Los Angeles. He'd campaigned on integrity, on holding powerful people accountable. But when he arrived at Greystone Mansion in the early morning hours of February 17, 1929, he faced a choice: investigate one of California's most powerful families, or accept the convenient narrative being offered. He chose the convenient narrative. Within 48 hours, Fitz announced his conclusion. Hugh Plunkett, suffering from a nervous disorder, had murdered Ned Doheny, then committed suicide. The case was closed. No inquest would be held. No grand jury would investigate. The matter was settled. Hugh's family was devastated, not just by his death, but by the immediate conclusion that he was a murderer. Hugh's nephew later said, quote, 14, After 2 days, Fitz refused to investigate further, even though forensic evidence suggested the official story was impossible, even though witnesses had given contradictory statements, even though the scene had been contaminated before police arrived. None of it mattered. The case was closed. Dr. Fishbaugh's testimony changed multiple times. Initially, he claimed both men were dead when he entered the room. Later, he admitted Ned was still breathing, still alive, when he burst in. Why lie about that detail unless you're hiding something? The doctor was caught in other lies, too. He initially claimed he went straight to the bedroom after arriving at Greystone. Later accounts suggested he'd been elsewhere in the house first. That time had passed before he and Lucy went to the guest bedroom. The timeline kept shifting, the details kept changing, but nobody in authority seemed to care. The most damning evidence was what forensic investigator Leslie White documented. White had decades of experience processing crime scenes. He knew what murder-suicide looked like. This wasn't it. The cigarette was the detail that convinced White something was deeply wrong. He'd processed hundreds of suicides. Never had he seen a suicide victim carefully holding a cigarette after shooting themselves in the head. The human hand doesn't maintain that kind of delicate grip after death, especially violent death from a gunshot to the brain. The cigarette should have fallen, been crushed, been dropped. Instead, it sat perfectly positioned between Hugh's fingers, still smoldering. Someone had placed that cigarette there after Hugh died, which meant someone had staged the scene. The warm gun bothered White too. Guns that have just been fired are warm from the explosion and barrel friction. But this gun was warm in a different way, as if it had been heated externally. White suspected someone had warmed the gun, possibly in an oven or near a stove, then placed it in Hugh's cooling hand to create the appearance he'd just fired it. Why do that? Unless you're trying to make a murder look like suicide. The wound angles didn't match either. Ned was shot at contact or near contact range. The killer was standing very close, possibly behind him, possibly while Ned was seated or kneeling. Hugh's wound was from a different distance. If one person shot both men, the wounds should look similar. They didn't. White photographed everything. He documented the blood spatter patterns that indicated the bodies had been moved. He noted the inconsistencies in the positioning. He wrote detailed reports about what he'd observed. All of it went into the official file, and all of it was ignored. Edward Doheny's private security had controlled the scene for hours before police arrived. They decided what could be photographed and what couldn't. They'd moved through the room, potentially destroying evidence. They'd positioned the bodies in ways that supported the murder-suicide narrative. By the time official investigators arrived, the crime scene was useless. Whatever had really happened was obscured by hours of interference. The media was carefully managed too. Edward Doheny had relationships with Los Angeles newspaper publishers. The coverage was sympathetic to the family. Poor Ned, murdered by his deranged employee. Tragic loss. The Doheny family in mourning. Very little investigative reporting happened. The newspapers largely accepted the official story and moved on. Hugh's family tried to raise questions. They believed Hugh had been murdered, not that he was the murderer, but they had no money, no power, no influence. The Dohenys had all three. Hugh's family's protests were ignored. Some Los Angeles law enforcement privately doubted the official story. White wasn't alone in his suspicions, but nobody was willing to challenge the conclusion publicly. You didn't accuse the Doheny family of murder or cover-up, not if you wanted to keep your job, not if you valued your career. Years later, documents emerged suggesting other investigators had also noted the problems with the case. Off-the-record comments indicated many people involved knew the official story was false. But in 1929, in Los Angeles, with Edward Doheny's power at its peak despite the Teapot Dome scandal, nobody was brave enough to demand a real investigation. The speed of the closure was remarkable. 2 days from discovery to case closed. No witness interviews beyond Lucy and the doctor. No interrogation of the Doheny family members who'd been in the house. No questioning of the servants who worked at Greystone. No examination of Hugh Plunkett's apartment to see if he'd left notes, letters, anything indicating his state of mind. Just murder-suicide Case closed. Move along. Burren Fitts, the reformer who'd promised to clean up Los Angeles corruption, had protected the richest family in California from scrutiny. His career continued. He was elected to higher office. The Doheny case didn't hurt him. If anything, it showed he understood how power worked in Los Angeles. You protected the powerful, they remembered. Leslie White's career continued too. He processed hundreds more crime scenes over the decades. The Greystone case remained the one that bothered him most. The one where he knew the truth had been buried. The one where justice had been denied because the victims and the suspects were too rich and too powerful to touch. Hugh Plunkett was buried as a murderer and suicide. His reputation destroyed, his memory tainted. His family given no answers, no justice, no explanation that made sense. Ned Doheny was buried as a victim, mourned, memorialized, eventually commemorated with a library at USC bearing his name. And the truth of what happened in that guest bedroom on February 16, 1929, was sealed away forever. Chapter 9. Burials and Questions. The funerals revealed another layer of mystery. Both Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett were buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Not a Catholic cemetery, despite the Doheny family's deep Catholic faith and generous donations to the church. Forest Lawn was a secular cemetery, beautifully landscaped, prestigious, but not consecrated ground. For a family as devoutly Catholic as the Dohenys, this was extraordinary. Edward Doheny had built St. Vincent de Paul Church. He donated enormous sums to Catholic institutions. His wife Estelle was known for her religious devotion. The family attended Mass regularly. Their Catholicism was central to their identity. Catholic doctrine in 1929 was clear. Suicide was a mortal sin. People who took their own lives could not be buried in Catholic cemeteries. Their souls were considered damned, beyond the church's power to help. This was absolute, inflexible church law. Ned Doheny was buried at Forest Lawn, not in the family plot at Calvary Cemetery where other Dohenys rested. The official story was that Hugh murdered Ned, then killed himself. If the family believed that story, Ned could have received full Catholic burial rights. He was the victim, not the suicide. He could have been buried in consecrated ground, but he wasn't. The choice of Forest Lawn suggested the family didn't believe the official story. If they thought Ned had killed himself, either by shooting Hugh then himself, or by some other scenario, Catholic burial would be impossible. The Forest Lawn burial indicated the family's private belief didn't match the public narrative. Hugh's burial was even more revealing. He was interred at Forest Lawn just yards away from Ned. Not far away, not in a different section, but close, within sight of each other. The Doheny family paid for Hugh's funeral and burial. They chose to place him near Ned. Why would a family bury their son's murderer nearby? Why pay for the funeral of the man who'd supposedly killed their beloved Ned? Why not distance themselves completely from Hugh, refuse to be associated with him, let his own family handle his burial? The proximity of the graves suggested a relationship the official story didn't acknowledge. It suggested forgiveness, understanding, maybe even recognition that Hugh wasn't the villain he'd been painted as. Hugh's nephew later said, quote 15, "The family's distress over the burial location indicated they'd accepted something about Ned's death that prevented Catholic rites." Either Ned had killed himself or the circumstances were so unclear that the church wouldn't allow burial in consecrated ground. Over the decades, various theories emerged about the relationship between Ned and Hugh. In 1929, homosexuality was criminal. It was socially unacceptable, religiously condemned, legally punishable. If Ned and Hugh had been lovers, that relationship would have been hidden, coded, deniable. Some evidence pointed toward a romantic relationship, Hugh's constant presence in Ned's life, the trust beyond normal employer-employee boundaries, the fact that Hugh oversaw Greystone's construction while Ned was away, making it arguably as much Hugh's home as Ned's, the intense closeness that everyone around them noted. The secular burial of both men close together suggested the family might have believed they were lovers. In Catholic doctrine of the era, homosexual relationships were gravely sinful. If the family suspected or knew about such a relationship, it might have complicated their understanding of what happened that night. A lover's quarrel ending in murder-suicide would still be tragedy, but of a different kind than the official story suggested. Other theories focused on the Teapot Dome scandal. Hugh was scheduled to testify. His testimony could destroy Albert Fall and possibly implicate Edward Doheny in bribery. Did Ned kill Hugh to silence him? Then kill himself out of guilt? Did someone else kill both of them to prevent their testimony? Was this a murder disguised as murder-suicide? The timing was certainly suspicious. Fall's trial was imminent. Both Ned and Hugh were crucial witnesses. Their deaths removed two people who knew exactly what happened in that hotel room when the $100,000 was delivered. Convenient for the defense that both witnesses died before they could testify. But if someone else killed them, who? And how did they escape detection? The crime scene was contaminated, yes, but completely manufacturing a double murder to look like murder-suicide required sophistication and access. Who could have done it? Some whispered about hired killers. Edward Doheny had employed private armies in Mexico to protect his oil fields. He had connections to rough men who do violent things for money. Could he have arranged his own son's death to protect himself from prison? That theory seemed too monstrous for most people to accept. A father ordering the murder of his only living child? Unthinkable. But Edward Doheny was 73 years old in February 1929. He'd built an empire over decades. He'd done questionable things to get there. Would he sacrifice his son to protect that empire and avoid prison? Could any father be that ruthless? We don't know. We'll never know. The people who knew the truth died that night, or took their secrets to their own graves. What we know is that on October 25, 1929, 8 months after the deaths at Greystone, Albert Fall was found guilty of accepting a bribe from Edward Doheny. He became the first cabinet member in American history to go to prison for crimes committed while in office. He was sentenced to 1 year and fined $100,000. The following year, in 1930, Edward Doheny was acquitted of paying the bribe that Fall was convicted of receiving. The jury reached the absurd conclusion that Fall accepted a bribe, but Doheny didn't pay one. Quote 16. The cynical observers had said, they were right. The key witnesses who could have clarified what happened in that hotel room, who could have testified about the true nature of the transaction, were both dead. Ned and Hugh took the truth with them to Forest Lawn, where they remained buried, yards apart, silent forever. Chapter 10. Lucy's long widowhood. Lucy Smith Doheny was 35 years old when her husband died. She had 5 children to raise. She had an enormous mansion that had been her home for exactly 4 months, and she had questions that would never be answered about what happened that February night. Lucy's account of the evening was the foundation for the official story. She heard a gunshot. She called the doctor instead of investigating or calling police. She and the doctor found Hugh outside the bedroom door. He warned them away, then went inside and shot himself. This was her testimony, and she never deviated from it. But Lucy also knew things she never said publicly. She'd been in the house that night. She'd heard everything. If there were other shots, other sounds, other people, she would have known. If the official story was a cover-up, she was part of it. Almost exactly 1 year after Ned's death on February 15, 1930, Lucy remarried. Her new husband was Lee M. Batson, a financial investor. The speed of the remarriage raised eyebrows. 1 year is a short mourning period, especially in that era, especially for a woman with 5 children and enormous wealth. Some speculated Lucy wanted to escape the Doheny family's control. Marrying Batson gave her a new identity, new protection, someone who would help her manage the children and the inheritance without Edward Doheny Sr.'s interference. Others suggested she simply couldn't bear to be alone in Greystone with all its memories. Whatever her reasons, Lucy and Lee Batson lived at Greystone together. They raised the 5 children in the mansion where their father had died. The guest bedroom where it happened remained part of the house, unavoidable, a permanent reminder. How did the children process growing up there? Did they know which room their father had died in? Were they told the official story, that Uncle Hugh had killed their father? Or did Lucy tell them something different, some private family truth that never became public? We don't know. The Doheny descendants have largely remained private about family history, especially about that night. A few have given interviews over the decades offering theories, but nothing definitive. Lucy managed the enormous household with Lee's help. The 15 servants maintained the grounds and the mansion. The children attended private schools. Life continued with the kind of privilege that enormous wealth provides. But the shadow of tragedy hung over everything. Edward Doheny Sr. visited Greystone. Though it must have been painful, his gift to his son had become his son's death place. Every time he walked those halls, he'd have known Ned died there, possibly because of the oil deals, possibly because of the Teapot Dome scandal, possibly because Edward's own ambition had created a situation that spiraled into violence. In 1935, Edward died, broken by scandal and grief. His oil empire survived, but his reputation never recovered. The man who'd been richer than Rockefeller died known primarily for Teapot Dome corruption and his son's mysterious death. Lucy continued at Greystone for 2 more decades. She raised her children to adulthood there. She maintained the estate, hosted gatherings, lived the life of a wealthy widow in Beverly Hills. But everyone who knew her said she was changed by what happened. How could she not be? In 1955, after 27 years at Greystone, Lucy finally sold the estate. She and Lee had decided to leave. The majority of the land went to the Paul Trousdale Corporation, developers who would create the prestigious Trousdale Estates neighborhood in the hills above Greystone. The mansion itself and the remaining 18 acres were sold separately to Henry Crown of Chicago for approximately $1.5 million. Lucy's decision to sell suggested she'd finally had enough. 27 years in the house where her husband died. 27 years managing the legacy of tragedy, she was done. Lucy lived to be over 100 years old. In her final years, according to her grandchildren, she would wake each morning, dress elegantly as if for a luncheon engagement, sit in a wingback chair in her living room with her purse, and wait. Wait for what? For whom? For appointments that no longer existed? For people long dead? Dementia had taken her memories, but some pattern remained, some echo of the social obligations that had defined her life. She sat and waited, dressed beautifully, ready for events that would never come. What did Lucy know about that February night? What did she see that she never told investigators? Did she protect someone? Did she lie to protect the family? Or was her account exactly what happened, and the mystery is simply that we don't want to believe something so traumatic could have such a simple explanation? Lucy died without ever changing her story. The gunshot, the call to the doctor finding Hugh outside the bedroom, the second shot. That was her testimony from February 17, 1929, and it remained her testimony until dementia took even those memories away. If she knew more, she took it to her grave. Chapter 11. Edward Doheny's final years. The death of his only son shattered Edward Doheny. He was 73 years old. He'd spent 5 decades building an oil empire. He'd survived the rough mining camps of New Mexico, the cutthroat Los Angeles oil boom, the dangerous Mexican oil fields during Revolution. He'd become one of the richest men in the world. And then he'd been destroyed by scandal and lost his heir to violence. The Teapot Dome trials continued. Edward was acquitted of bribery in 1930, the impossible verdict that Fall accepted a bribe, but Doheny didn't pay one. But acquittal wasn't vindication. Everyone knew what had happened. The loan was a bribe. The oil leases were corrupt. Edward Doheny had bought a cabinet member. The law might not be able to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, but the public knew. The financial consequences were severe. The Supreme Court had invalidated the oil leases. The government demanded repayment of profits. Stockholders in Doheny's companies sued, claiming fraud and mismanagement. The lawsuits multiplied. By the time everything was settled, Edward was ordered to pay $47 million in settlements, taxes, and penalties. $47 million. Even for one of America's richest men, that was devastating. The oil empire survived but was severely damaged. The Doheny reputation, once associated with pioneering success, was now permanently linked to corruption. Edward withdrew from public life. He became a recluse in his Chester Place mansion in Los Angeles, the gated Victorian estate he'd bought decades earlier. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms and negotiated with presidents now rarely left his house. The stress, the scandal, the loss of Ned. It broke him. But in 1932, 3 years after Ned's death, Edward made one final public gesture. He donated $1,100,000 to the University of Southern California to build a library in Ned's memory. The Edward L. Doheny Jr. Memorial Library opened on the USC campus with great ceremony. California Governor James Rolfe Jr. attended the dedication. He declared, "Here we see perpetuated the love of a father for his dutiful son." The words were meant to honor Ned, to remember him as something other than a victim in a mysterious death. Edward wanted Ned remembered as a son who'd served his father's empire faithfully, not as a man who died in scandal. The library still stands at USC. Students study there without knowing the tragedy behind its funding. The Doheny name on the building is just a name, not a story of oil fortunes, political corruption, and unexplained violence. Edward Doheny died September 8, 1935, at age 79. He'd outlived his daughter Eileen by decades. He'd outlived his son Ned by 6 years. Of his children, none survived him. The dynasty he'd tried to build ended with him. His funeral was held at St. Vincent's Church, the Catholic church he'd built. The Mass was elaborate, honoring a man who donated millions to the church despite his tarnished reputation. The church took his money and gave him the burial rights Ned had been denied. Edward left $85 million when he died. Despite the penalties and settlements from Teapot Dome, despite everything, he remained extraordinarily wealthy. The oil empire he'd built continued. Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company survived, but the Doheny name was permanently stained. His widow, Estelle Doheny, did something extraordinary after Edward's death. She burned hundreds of letters and business documents. Biographer Margaret Leslie Davis later described this as destroying the written remnants of Edward Doheny's life. Entire file cabinets of correspondence, business records, personal letters, all fed into fires. Why? What was Estelle hiding? What did those documents contain that needed to be destroyed? The most obvious answer is that they contained evidence of criminal activity beyond what was proven in court. Details of other bribes, other corrupt deals, other illegal operations. Edward had been acquitted of bribery, but everyone knew he was guilty. Perhaps the documents would have proven it beyond any doubt. Or perhaps they contained information about Ned's death. Letters discussing what really happened, documents revealing who knew what and when. Evidence that the official story was false. We'll never know because Estelle burned it all. The destruction of documents was common among those implicated in Teapot Dome. President Harding's papers were destroyed after his death. Attorney General Harry Daugherty's files disappeared. Calvin Coolidge's records related to the scandal were lost. Albert Fall's personal papers were incomplete. Everyone involved seemed to believe that destroying evidence was the safest course. Estelle lived until 1958. She donated Chester Place and its surrounding properties to the Catholic Church. The church eventually gave the property to Mount St. Mary's College, which still occupies it today. The Doheny legacy in Los Angeles includes the library at USC, the campus at Mount St. Mary's, St. Vincent's Church, and the street named Doheny Drive in Beverly Hills. But the legacy also includes Teapot Dome, the scandal that defined government corruption for half a century. And it includes Greystone Mansion, the magnificent gift that became a murder scene. Edward Doheny built an empire. He created institutions. He pioneered the oil industry in California and Mexico. He became richer than almost anyone in American history. And in the end, he died broken, his reputation destroyed. His son dead under mysterious circumstances, his legacy forever tainted by scandal. The man who'd come from nothing and built everything died having lost what mattered most. Chapter 12. The Mansion Changes Hands. For 27 years after Ned's death, Greystone remained in Lucy Doheny Batson's hands. Then in 1955, she finally sold it. The estate that had cost over $3 million to build was divided. The majority of the 415 acres went to Paul Trousdale Corporation for development. What became Trousdale Estates, one of Beverly Hills' most prestigious neighborhoods, was carved from the original Doheny property. The mansion itself and the remaining 18 acres were sold separately to Henry Crown of Chicago for approximately $1.5 million. Crown was an industrialist, wealthy, but not interested in living at Greystone. He saw it as an investment, a prestige property that could be leased for various uses. Crown never occupied Greystone. Instead, he leased it primarily to film studios. Hollywood had discovered the mansion's cinematic potential. The dramatic descending staircase, the stone facade, the grand rooms, they all photographed beautifully. Greystone began appearing in movies and television shows, a magnificent backdrop for stories that had nothing to do with the tragedy that happened there. The mansion sat mostly empty through the late 1950s and early 1960s, used occasionally for filming but otherwise vacant. The grounds required maintenance. The house needed care to prevent deterioration. But without someone living there, without the energy of a household, Greystone felt abandoned. In 1963, Henry Crown made an announcement that horrified Los Angeles architectural preservationists. He planned to demolish Greystone Mansion and subdivide the remaining 18 acres for residential development. The economics made sense. The land was worth more as house lots than as one enormous white elephant of a mansion. Crown had never intended to preserve Greystone. He'd wanted the land. The announcement created immediate controversy. Greystone was California's most expensive historic residence. It represented an era of craftsmanship and architectural ambition that would never be repeated. Tearing it down would erase an important piece of Los Angeles history, no matter how dark that history was. Beverly Hills city officials scrambled to find a solution. They didn't have direct authority to stop Crown from demolishing a building on private property, but they had an idea that might save Greystone while serving a municipal need. The hilltop location of Greystone Mansion provided tremendous natural water pressure. Beverly Hills needed reservoir capacity for its growing population. If the city could acquire the property, they could install a massive water tank underground while preserving the mansion and grounds as a public park. Negotiations began. In 1965, the city of Beverly Hills purchased Greystone from Henry Crown for approximately $1,100,000. Crown made money on the deal. The city got its water reservoir site, and Greystone was saved from demolition. The city's plan was practical. Build a 19-million-gallon water tank on the property, using the elevation to create pressure for the city's water system. Preserve the mansion and grounds as public park space. Possibly lease the building to organizations that could maintain it while making it available for public benefit. The water tank was constructed underground. To this day, it serves as Beverly Hills' largest reservoir, a crucial piece of infrastructure hidden beneath the elegant grounds where the Doheny family once strolled. For the mansion itself, the city found a prestigious tenant. In 1965, the American Film Institute was founded, dedicated to preserving and advancing the art of filmmaking. The AFI needed a headquarters. Beverly Hills offered to lease them Greystone for $1 per year, hoping the institute would pay for repairs and upkeep in exchange for the nominal rent. The AFI accepted. From 1965 to 1982, Greystone Mansion served as the American Film Institute's headquarters. Film students trained there. AFI programs operated from the historic rooms. The mansion that Edward Doheny built for his son became a center for preserving and teaching film art. The irony was profound. Greystone had been built to establish Doheny dynasty permanence. Instead, it became famous through movies, its image captured on film and shown to millions who'd never visit. The tragedy that happened there in 1929 was mostly forgotten by the 1970s. Greystone was just a beautiful mansion where movies were made. On September 16, 1971, the city formally dedicated Greystone Mansion and its grounds as a public park. For the first time since it was built, ordinary people could walk the grounds. The estate that represented the most extreme wealth and privilege in California's history was now accessible to anyone who wanted to visit. 5 years later, on April 23, 1976, Greystone was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The designation recognized its architectural significance and ensured federal protection. The mansion that had almost been demolished a decade earlier was now officially recognized as an important piece of American architectural heritage. In 1982, the American Film Institute moved out, relocating to other facilities. Greystone became primarily an events venue and public park. The city began renting it for weddings, corporate events, filming. The revenue helped maintain the expensive property. In 2013, Beverly Hills designated Greystone as Historic Landmark Number 4, adding local protection to the federal designation. The mansion was secured for future generations. But what saved Greystone ultimately wasn't government designation or public park status. It was Hollywood. The mansion's appearance in hundreds of films and television shows made it iconic. Audiences might not know the name Greystone, but they recognize the staircase, the facade, the grounds. The mansion became part of popular culture. Chapter 13: Hollywood's Most Famous Murder House. The descending staircase at Greystone Mansion is one of the most photographed architectural features in Hollywood. It's appeared in The Big Lebowski, Ghostbusters, Spider-Man, X-Men, The Social Network, There Will Be Blood, and dozens more. Directors love it because it photographs dramatically, the curve and height creating visual interest, the stone and carved wood providing texture. Most people who watch these movies have no idea they're looking at the Doheny mansion. They don't know the staircase they're admiring was built by a corrupt oil tycoon for his doomed son. They don't know that just off camera, down a hallway in the East Wing, is the guest bedroom where Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett died. Greystone has been a filming location since the 1950s, but its use accelerated after the city acquired it in 1965. The American Film Institute's presence made it familiar to filmmakers. The city's willingness to rent it for productions brought steady revenue, and the mansion's architecture provided something unique: old-world European grandeur in sunny California. Horror films have used it. Comedies have used it. Action movies, dramas, period pieces, they've all found Greystone's versatile spaces useful. The grand hall becomes a villain's lair. The bedroom becomes a romantic setting. The grounds become a garden party scene. Greystone transforms into whatever story needs it to be. In 2007, the film There Will Be Blood used Greystone extensively. The movie, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, was loosely based on Upton Sinclair's novel Oil, which was itself loosely inspired by Edward Doheny's life. The production renovated Greystone's two-lane bowling alley for use in the film, contributing to the mansion's maintenance while creating a meta-narrative. A movie about a corrupt oil tycoon filmed in the actual corrupt oil tycoon's mansion. Television shows have used Greystone regularly. Gilmore Girls, NCIS, Murder. She Wrote, The West Wing, countless others. Music videos have been filmed there, including multiple videos by Mariah Carey. The mansion appears everywhere in popular culture, usually unidentified, just a beautiful backdrop. But Greystone's most unusual theatrical use began in 2002. Playwright Catherine Bates wrote The Manor, a fictionalized account of the Doheny family and the deaths at Greystone. Directed by Beverly Olivan and produced by Theater 40 of Beverly Hills, the play is performed annually inside Greystone Mansion. The audience is separated into groups. Each group watches different scenes in different rooms, experiencing the story in varying orders. The mansion itself becomes part of the performance. You're not watching a play about Greystone. You're inside Greystone, walking its halls, entering its rooms, while actors perform the tragedy that happened there. The Manor has become Los Angeles' longest-running play. Every year, new audiences experience the fictionalized version of what happened to Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett. The play takes dramatic license, creating dialogue and scenarios that may or may not reflect truth. But it keeps the story alive, reminds people that Greystone has a history beyond beautiful architecture. Some find the manor tasteless. A tragedy becoming entertainment, performed in the actual location where people died, seems exploitative. Others argue it's appropriate commemoration, ensuring the deaths aren't forgotten, that the questions raised that night remain part of Greystone's legacy. The mansion's use for weddings is perhaps stranger. Couples marry at Greystone regularly, exchanging vows in a house where a marriage ended in unexplained violence. The grounds are beautiful. The architecture is stunning, and most couples don't know or don't care about the history. It's just a pretty venue. Tours of Greystone happen monthly through the Beverly Hills Parks and Recreation Department. The first floor and theater are open for self-guided tours. Visitors walk the same halls Ned and Lucy walked. They see the same staircase, the same grand spaces. But they don't see the guest bedroom, where it happened. That remains closed. The city is careful about what they show. Greystone is marketed as architectural treasure and filming location, not as murder house. The tragedy is acknowledged but not emphasized. The focus is on Gordon Kaufman's design, on the craftsmanship, on the gardens, on the film shot there. But everyone knows. The tour guides mention it carefully. The pamphlets acknowledge it obliquely, and some visitors come specifically because of the deaths, not despite them. Dark tourism, people call it. The fascination with tragedy, with violence, with mystery. Greystone has become both architectural landmark and ghost story. People report strange occurrences in the mansion, footsteps when no one's there, doors closing inexplicably, the feeling of being watched in empty rooms. Whether these are actual paranormal events or just the power of suggestion, they're part of Greystone's mystique now. The mansion that Edward Doheny built to establish his family's permanent place in California society has instead become permanent through tragedy and mystery. The Doheny name is remembered not because Ned's descendants carried on a dynasty, but because Ned died under circumstances that were never explained. Greystone achieved immortality not through the family who built it, but through the questions that have never been answered. Chapter 14. Theories that won't die. 95 years have passed since February 16, 1929. Everyone directly involved is dead. The physical evidence is long gone. The crime scene was contaminated within hours and has since been walked through by thousands of tourists, wedding guests, film crews. Whatever forensic truth existed that night was destroyed decades ago, and yet the theories persist. What really happened in that guest bedroom? The official story. Murder-Suicide by Hugh Plunkett. Hugh Plunkett, driven mad by stress over the upcoming Teapot Dome trial, murdered his friend and employer, Ned Doheny, then killed himself. This was District Attorney Buren Fitz's conclusion within 48 hours. Problems with this theory. The forensic evidence doesn't support it. The cigarette carefully held in Hugh's fingers, the warm gun that seemed heated, the different wound patterns suggesting two shooters, or at least two different shooting positions. The 4-hour delay before police were called, the moved bodies, the contaminated crime scene. Hugh's family rejected this theory completely. They believed Hugh was murdered, not that he was the murderer. Hugh's nephew said the Dohenys were just so powerful that the truth was suppressed. Theory 2. Ned killed Hugh, then himself Ned, under enormous pressure from the trial, killed Hugh to prevent his testimony, then killed himself out of guilt or to avoid the consequences. This explains the secular burial. If Ned committed suicide, he couldn't be buried in Catholic cemetery. The family's choice of forest lawn suggested they believed something happened that prevented Catholic rites. It explains Hugh being buried nearby at the family's expense. If Ned killed Hugh, the family might have felt responsible, might have wanted to honor Hugh, despite what happened. Problems. Why would Ned kill Hugh in his own home, with his wife present, in a way that would immediately raise suspicions? If he wanted Hugh silenced, There were subtler methods available to wealthy men, and the forensic evidence suggesting the gun was heated and placed in Hugh's hand doesn't fit this scenario either. Theory 3. Lucy killed both men. Lucy discovered Ned and Hugh in a compromising situation, possibly a sexual encounter. Enraged or horrified, she shot both men, then staged the murder-suicide withheld from Dr. Fishbaugh and the family's security. This explains Lucy's strange behavior, hearing a gunshot and calling the doctor instead of investigating, the 4-hour delay, her ability to control the narrative as the only living witness. It explains why she'd protect Ned's reputation with a story that blamed Hugh. Better for her children to believe their father was murdered by a deranged employee than to believe he was in a homosexual relationship. Problems. This requires Lucy to be a calculating murderer capable of shooting 2 people at close range, staging an elaborate scene, maintaining a false story for the rest of her life, and convincing doctors and investigators to participate in a cover-up. Possible, but difficult to believe. Theory 4. A third person. Someone else killed both Ned and Hugh. Possibly a hired killer sent to eliminate 2 witnesses who could destroy Edward Doheny in the upcoming trial. The murders were staged to look like murder-suicide. This explains the forensic inconsistencies. A professional killer would know how to stage a scene. The warm gun, the positioned cigarette, the moved bodies all make sense if someone deliberately created the murder-suicide appearance. It explains the rapid case closure. If Edward Doheny arranged the murders, he'd ensure investigators reached the conclusion he wanted. Problems. How did the killer escape? Greystone had staff, security, multiple people present. A stranger couldn't wander in, kill 2 people, stage the scene, and leave undetected. Unless the killer had help from inside the household, this seems impossible. Theory 5. Lovers' quarrel. Ned and Hugh were lovers. The stress of the upcoming trial, combined with the threat of being committed to a sanitarium, led to a confrontation that escalated to violence. Either Hugh killed Ned then himself, or Ned killed Hugh then himself, but it was a crime of passion between lovers, not a premeditated murder. This explains the close burial. The family suspected or knew about the relationship and chose to bury them near each other, acknowledging a bond they couldn't publicly admit. It explains the secular burial for both. Homosexual relationships were considered sinful. Catholic burial might have been denied if church authorities suspected the relationship. It explains Hugh's constant presence in Ned's life, the unusual closeness, the trust beyond normal employer-employee boundaries. Problems. This is pure speculation based on circumstantial evidence. There's no definitive proof Ned and Hugh were lovers. The theory relies on reading between lines, interpreting silences, assuming relationships that were carefully hidden. What Ned's descendants believe. Decades later, some of Ned's descendants offered their theory. Hugh's nephew said it was Ned who was truly unstable. Ned's grandson supported this, believing his grandfather struggled with depression. I have a strong sense that there was loneliness there. With his dad away all the time and his mom dying like that, I would think that there would be some unfinished business. This theory suggests Ned killed Hugh, possibly during a mental breakdown, then killed himself. Hugh wasn't the unstable one. Ned was. The family lied to protect Ned's reputation and spare his children the knowledge that their father was a murderer and suicide. This fits with the secular burial and the family's apparent belief that Ned couldn't receive Catholic rites. It fits with burying Hugh nearby at family expense, acknowledging he was a victim, not a villain. But it's still speculation. The descendants weren't there. They're interpreting family stories, silences, choices made 90 years ago. They might be right. They might be projecting modern understanding onto a situation they can only imagine. The unanswerable question. What really happened in that guest bedroom on February 16, 1929? We'll never know with certainty. The people who knew the truth are all dead. The evidence was contaminated or destroyed. The official investigation was a sham. The family's private beliefs were never fully documented. What we know is that two men died. Both were key witnesses in a massive political scandal. Both died before they could testify. The deaths were investigated for 48 hours, then declared solved. The forensic evidence suggested the official story was false. The family's burial choices suggested they didn't believe the official story either. Money and power buried the truth. The Doheny family's enormous wealth ensured that real investigation never happened. District Attorney Fitz closed the case because that's what powerful families expected. The media largely accepted the official story because that's what Edward Doheny's connections to newspaper publishers ensured. Hugh Plunkett died branded a murderer, his reputation destroyed, his family denied answers. His grave just yards from Ned's silent testimony to a relationship and a tragedy that were never honestly examined. Ned Doheny died a victim in the official story, but possibly a suicide or murderer in reality. His children grew up not knowing for certain how their father died. His grave in secular ground instead of the family's Catholic plot, suggesting the family's private belief didn't match public narrative. And Greystone Mansion stands, beautiful and haunted, the scene of a crime that was never solved, a mystery that will never be answered, a testament to what happens when wealth and power decide that truth is less important than reputation. Today, Greystone Mansion is a public park. You can visit Tuesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. in winter, 6 p.m. in summer. Parking is free. The grounds are beautifully maintained. The terraced gardens cascade down the hillside, just as Paul Thien designed them. The waterfalls still flow. The formal English gardens still bloom. The mansion itself is closed most days, but monthly tours allow visitors to walk the first floor. You can see the grand hall with its black and white marble. You can climb that famous descending staircase. You can stand in rooms where Edward Doheny believed his dynasty would continue for generations. The guest bedroom where Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett died remains closed to the public. It's still there, part of the East Wing, but you can't visit it. The room where the mystery happened remains private, as if keeping its secrets even now. Greystone hosts weddings, corporate events, cultural programs. The Beverly Hills Flower and Garden Festival happens there annually. The grounds serve as location for photo shoots, music videos, films, television shows. The mansion that was built as a private residence has become one of Los Angeles' most recognized public spaces. But walk those grounds at dusk, when the last visitors are leaving, when shadows stretch across the terraces, and you can feel the weight of history. This magnificent house was built on oil money made through deals that weren't always clean. It was commissioned by a father for a son who died violently within months of moving in. It witnessed a tragedy that was covered up, questions that were never answered, truth that was buried by power and money. Greystone represents a particular American story. The Gilded Age belief that enough money could create permanence, that wealth could buy dynasty, that magnificence in architecture could establish lasting legacy. Edward Doheny was wrong. The dynasty ended with Ned's death. The family name is remembered primarily for scandal and mystery. The magnificent mansion he built was saved not by Doheny descendants, but by public acquisition. What survives is the architecture. Gordon Kaufman created something beautiful and enduring. The craftsmanship of those hand-carved banisters, the proportions of the rooms, the way stone and slate were assembled. This was work meant to last centuries. And it has. The mansion Kaufman designed will likely stand for generations more. But the people are gone. Edward Doheny, who came from nothing and built everything, died broken and disgraced. Ned Doheny, the only son who was supposed to inherit an empire, died at 35 under circumstances never explained. Hugh Plunkett, the loyal secretary and friend, died branded a murderer. Lucy Doheny Batson, the widow who knew more than she ever told, died after living to over 100, her final years lost to dementia that erased even her carefully maintained story. The curse, if you believe in such things, took them all. First Eileen, Edward's daughter, dead at 7. Then Ned, shot in his own home. Then Edward himself, destroyed by scandal and grief. The Doheny dynasty that was supposed to rival Rockefeller and Carnegie lasted one generation before collapse. What remains are questions. What really happened that February night? Was it murder-suicide as the official story claimed? Was it a lover's quarrel turned violent? Was it witness elimination to protect Edward Doheny from prison? Was it something else entirely? Some scenario we haven't imagined? We'll never know. The evidence is gone. The witnesses are dead. The truth was buried with money and power 95 years ago. But Greystone stands. Walk its grounds. Tour its halls. Stand at the base of that famous staircase and look up at the hand-carved wood and stone. Think about the fact that this magnificent house, built at almost unimaginable expense, was home to its owner for exactly 4 months before becoming a crime scene. Think about what that says about American ambition, about the limits of wealth, about the difference between building something and protecting it, about the way tragedy can transform triumph into cautionary tale. Greystone was supposed to be Edward Doheny's greatest gift to his son. Instead, it became Ned's tomb and Edward's monument to failure. The house survived. The family didn't. The mystery persists. If you visit Beverly Hills, if you're interested in architecture and history, if you want to walk the grounds where this story unfolded, Greystone Mansion is at 905 Loma Vista Drive. Check the website for current tour schedules and event calendars. Stand where it happened. Feel the weight of unanswered questions. And remember that some mysteries, no matter how much time passes, remain mysteries forever. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself drawn into the tragedy and mystery of Greystone, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates history and architecture. These stories matter. The houses remember even when we forget.